Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on how to show different types of construction materials in the different kinds of drawings in our print sets. Let's start out looking at masonry. Remember that masonry is brick, CMU, and tile and stone. So in plan view, you can sometimes see masonry cut in brick walls and fireplaces. Right? The symbol for cut brick and cut masonry is a repeated diagonal hatch pattern. In general, in plans, we don't show individual bricks. All right, that's just a little bit too much detail. We just show the overall outline filled with the diagonal hatch. You can also see masonry in plans that is not cut, all right? And that would be masonry floors. You could see a fireplace hearth, maybe a brick patio or a tile floor. Sometimes in the plans will show this masonry pattern, and you see a couple of examples of that here. Or if that pattern is not important, if you're not trying to communicate that in this particular drawing, the material could just be noted. Moving on to elevations, masonry can be shown in a couple of different ways, depending on the drawing scale and the drawing intent. First of all, it could just be noted. Like I said with plans, if that's not the intent of that particular drawing, you can just make a note, masonry here. All right. But it is fairly common to show a horizontal line pattern for brick masonry. Right? And the lines are scaled to match the height of one course of masonry. So we would see those horizontal lines, but not necessarily the vertical lines in between individual bricks. If you're looking at large scale elevations or maybe trying to portray a more complicated pattern, the masonry can be shown with its full pattern. All right, so here's an example from the multifamily housing print set that you'll see a little later in the semester. And what we have here on the upper portion of the wall is brick, and it's shown with those horizontal lines we were just talking about. On the lower portion of the wall, the ground story of this building has a stone pattern, all right? And so we're actually seeing the full pattern of the stone down here. Now notice another thing, the brick pattern isn't shown all the way across the elevation. What they did was show a little bit of it and then stop. All right. The rest of the brick is omitted from the elevation for clarity, all right, because it's very hard to put these kind of notes and other information when you have that much hatch pattern going on. When you take a look at masonry cut in section or in detail, you're going to see that same diagonal hatch pattern that we saw when it was cut in plan. All right, so take a look at this detail you've already seen earlier in this video and find the brick. The last material I want to cover this week is metal, and specifically I'm going to talk about structural steel. Those are the heavy steel beams and columns. All right, and then also light gauge steel. Those are going to be the thin steel studs. Starting out with the structural steel, you can show a structural steel beam on an architectural plan or a structural framing plan, and it's typically a dashed dot line along the center line of the beam. All right, and so here's an example from the floor framing plan in the brick veneer house print set. Occasionally, you'll see this on an architectural set with two lines indicating the actual width of the beam. It depends on what they're trying to convey with the particular drawing. Now, remembering that a plan view is a horizontal cut and then looking down, sometimes you'll see structural steel columns cut in plan views. And what you're going to see is the outline of the steel shape, and if the drawing is in a large enough scale, if you're zoomed in enough for it to use a hatch pattern, it's a repeated double diagonal line, and you'll see that in another slide. All right. This example is coming from the Veterinary Center print set. Go ahead and pause here and see if you can find in this detail the brick and the CMU, and also the light gauge steel framing. Any structural steel cut in a section view or a detail is going to show a heavy outline of the steel shape. And again, like I mentioned, if you are zoomed in enough, if you are using a large enough scale to see a hatch pattern, it's a repeated double diagonal line. So you can see two together, two together, two together. That's steel. Let's talk about light gauge steel. And just to remember what that is, I've added a photo here so you can see those light gauge steel stud members. A steel stud wall drawn up on a plan will look just like a wood wall, two solid parallel lines. Really the only way to tell the difference is to look for information in the notes, in the typical details, maybe in the wall tags or the partition types. Just like wood framing, light gauge steel framing is typically not shown in elevation. So we're going to see whatever finish or siding is applied to these walls and not the actual studs. But these light gauge steel studs have a very distinctive outline when they're cut in a plan or a section detail, and they show kind of a C-shaped. It looks like this. I put a photo on here for you so you can see that they form a C shape. Because they're so thin, it's actually fairly hard to see them on your details. Let's take a look at this example from the Veterinary Center print set. All right, and looking down here at the plan detail, that's going to be this area right here. Remembering that the plan detail is going to be a horizontal cut and then looking down. You can see this C-shaped light gauge steel stud right here, and that is a vertical member that we're cutting and looking down at. In the section detail right above it, remember that a section is a vertical cut, and then we are looking sideways or horizontal at that wall. All right, and so we're going to see the steel studs three places. First of all, they are at the top track and the bottom track. All right, hard to see, all right, because they're so thin. And also, I didn't highlight it, but we would be looking at the edges of a vertical steel stud right here in the middle of the wall. Thanks, everyone. We've just taken a look at many different ways to portray construction materials in our print sets.